Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with Levi Browde, Executive Director of the Falun Gong Information Center. He sheds light on how the persecution of the spiritual discipline Falun Gong in China is a reflection of the Chinese regime's greater goals against the free world, and more in a newly released report, Pandemic, Persecution, and Pushback. Let's dive in. Levi Browde, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
So you recently helped come out with a report called The Pandemic, Persecution, and Pushback. So tell us kind of what it covered and what were your biggest findings from it?
Normally we do an annual report, but this report actually covers about 2.5 years because we felt the time, especially when COVID was raging not only across the world, but certainly in China, presented a very unique set of circumstances, and it's something that people really need to know about. So we really focused this latest report on the last 2.5 years. In terms of latest trends, we found a few things that were rather difficult to sort of accept. We found, and actually there was a few things that were surprising. So the first thing is that even though the lockdowns in China really started unfolding in March and April and became very, very heavy through that summer, we actually saw an escalation of 100% in terms of the Falun Gong practitioners who were being harassed, which is a category we use to represent, when someone ransacks their home or threatens them at work, but falls short of actually bringing them into custody. So the number of harassments and the number of arrests went up by 100% from the spring and summer of 2020 and that same period in 2019. And the reason for that is because Falun Gong, the network of Falun Gong practitioners inside China, has become very resourceful in getting news out of China into the hands of human rights workers and media in the West. And so anytime they want to clamp down on a story, such as COVID, the Falun Gong community becomes the first target. And so that was the first trend that we saw. The second trend we saw was a new campaign, or at least it was at that time, called the Zero Out campaign. And it's something they started in early 2020. And the basic plan was to, in all the regions of China, bring the number of Falun Gong practitioners down to zero. That's why they call it Zero Out. And they use all kinds of methods, not just the normal practice of detaining and abusing practitioners, but just sort of threatening their jobs, their family, their livelihood, breaking into their homes in the middle of the night or during dinner while everybody's sitting around the table. And they use these methods to try and bring the number of practitioners in each region down to zero. Of course, that didn't work, but that was the campaign that they unleashed. We also saw an escalation. There was a lot of highly visible events last year. We had the Olympics. We had the 100th centennial. And anytime there's a major event in China where they really want to manage what's happening in the news, again, they'll clamp down on the Falun Gong community to sort of manage the messaging and stories that are coming out of China. The last trend that we saw was a legal trend. Now, when the persecution of Falun Gong first started in 1999, lawyers, of course, were not taking any Falun Gong cases. They were way too scared to do that. But over the years, there were some very brave lawyers that started to take cases. What we saw in as early as 2019, but actually really 2020, 2021, is actually formal edicts from the Chinese government saying you cannot defend a Falun Gong practitioner. Something called Document 226. And that started in one of the provinces and kind of spread out to the other provinces. So that was another trend that we saw going on in the last year and a half in China.
So Levi, who are these Falun Gong and why is the regime so against them? Why are they the main targets?
So that's a good question. I mean, the story of Falun Gong is an interesting and tragic story, because if you look back in the 1990s, Falun Gong was widely popular. It's essentially a Buddhist-based spiritual practice. It involves meditation, studying of Buddhist-based principles, all centered around truthfulness, compassion, tolerance. So when someone says they're a Falun Gong practitioner, basically they're meditating in the morning, doing exercises, and they're studying those principles and trying to adopt those principles into their life, be a little bit more honest and compassionate as they go through their life. That's what Falun Gong is. And when it was first introduced to public in 1992, very quickly it became popular in China. I mean, hundreds of millions, tens of millions of people were taking up the practice very quickly. By 1999, the Chinese government actually did a survey because they noticed there's so many people doing this Falun Gong. If you looked at, in cities and towns and villages across China, in the parks in the morning, it was all Falun Gong. It was everywhere. So they did a survey actually in the end of 1998, early 1999. They found 100 million people were practicing. So at that point, there was a couple of key leaders in the Communist Party, mainly the head of the party, Jiang Zemin, who said, crush it, kill it. And there was a big power struggle, actually, in the summer of 1999, because he wanted to crush it. A lot of the senior members, even members of the Politburo, knew Falun Gong very well, and they said, this is crazy. This is a benign, wonderful practice. It's actually making people very healthy. We're not going to do this. So it was a huge power struggle. Jiang Zemin won the day, and so for the last 23 years, from that directive, they have been trying to eliminate Falun Gong inside China. Now, one of the reasons they go after Falun Gong so viciously was initially, it's sort of different phases. Initially, it was to carry out this directive by the top man in the party. He ordered that Falun Gong be crushed, so everybody had to fall in line after that power struggle. And so that's what happened for a few years inside China. But soon, it became clear that the Falun Gong community, both inside China and really around the world, was not going away into the night very quietly. And in fact, they had become a very active voice, not just to report on the abuses that were happening to Falun Gong throughout China, but actually the abuses the Chinese Communist Party has unleashed on the Chinese people in the world since its inception. So I'll give you an example. Even today, and going back for like the last 15 years, tens of millions of Falun Gong practitioners inside China participate in what we call an underground media or print shop network, where in the back room they've got a little printer and there's these websites that they can download leaflets that explain to the Chinese citizenry the abuses that Falun Gong is facing, the tyrannical way the CCP has ruled the Chinese people going back decades, the Cultural Revolution, all kinds of things, all the way back to 1949. And usually under cover of night, they will take these leaflets and sometimes VCDs and they'll put it on doorsteps. And this is in every major city, every town, every village across China. So the Falun Gong community inside China has become an extremely vocal entity to educate what the Chinese people are not getting on state-run television. And so that is a big concern, obviously, to the CCP leadership. And so what started out as a suppression of sort of a religious minority has turned into really, from the CCP's perspective, a desperate battle to silence a very brave voice that's telling the truth about what the CCP is doing inside China and around the world. And it's the same outside China. If you look at communities of Falun Gong in the United States and Canada, across Europe, the CCP has been targeting those communities in some horrific ways, actually, for the same reason, to silence them. Because, again, this community has become what I think is the single largest whistleblower of the CCP's crimes on the world stage. And so it is a top priority, and always has been, for the CCP to silence the Falun Gong community.
So, Levi, it sounds like, these whistleblowers of basically crimes against humanity, honestly, happening inside China isn't just for the Chinese people, but also helping, say, us in the Western world find true information coming out of China. So you mentioned that the Chinese regime is also going after people overseas. How are they able to do that?
In a variety of ways. I mean, it started out as sort of very base thuggery. We've had, at least in the Falun Gong community, we've had people in the early days when the persecution first started. We had people here in Manhattan whose apartments were ransacked several times. One of them actually had to leave and go into hiding because of Chinese thugs, obviously hired by the Chinese government. The consulate here was attacking them physically. And we've had that going on for years. People beaten up in Chicago and San Francisco. We had one guy who was actually at the time pioneering software so that to allow Chinese people to reach the free internet. He was sitting in his home, a very nice neighborhood in Atlanta. A couple Asian people knock on the door, pretending to be a water delivery. They force their way in. They beat him up. They're speaking Chinese. And, very nice home. They steal nothing except his computers and his hard drives. And so this kind of thuggery has been a hallmark of their transnational repression against Falun Gong. But it's far more sophisticated than that these days. They use their diplomatic corps all around the world to go after Falun Gong pressuring our legislators, pressuring our governments, our governors, our mayors, not to support Falun Gong, not to speak out against the persecution in China, and business entities. Obviously, many of our businesses, including our media, have enormous deals inside China, and that has coincided with an alarming silence on the Falun Gong issue. And so the targeting of Falun Gong by the Chinese regime is multifaceted, and it is very sophisticated, and it is to some extent focused here in the United States, but it's all around the world.
Given how widespread this, say, transnational suppression is, what can be done? Why is this even legal? What can outside countries do?
Unfortunately, by their own admission, our government, Western governments around the world really, are wholly unprepared for this, because normally when they're dealing with an adversarial country, it comes in the form of their diplomats or their military or something like that. And really, CCP has weaponized absolutely everything of their country, including their corporations, including their citizens, including, unfortunately, even their students that come over here. I mean, there's many cases of the Chinese consulate sort of pressuring and really blackmailing Chinese students here to help in this larger process. So we are playing catch up, unfortunately. And by we, I mean the United States government and all Western democracies. And I think the first thing they need to do is start identifying these individuals that are going after. They're beating us up in the streets in San Francisco and Chicago. But as important, if not more important, is they need to understand and take action against these various entities, the diplomatic corps, the Chinese media that is here, and honestly, even Chinese corporations, and understand them for what they really are. They are foreign agents, and they should have to register as such. They should be limited as a foreign agent, and they should be monitored as foreign agents, because that's really what they're doing here. I mean, it's interesting. Houston is an interesting case. You know, there was a lot of news, I think it was last year, where they shut the Houston consulate down. It might have been the year before. The Falun Gong community had been targeted a lot in the Houston area for years, and a lot of it was coming out of the consulate. We knew that. And there was a notable change in the community in Houston when that consulate shut down. And you know, you see that again all over the United States. So I think we need to start taking all these different organs of the Chinese state, recognizing them for what they are, and restricting them, curtailing them, making the registers foreign agents, because again, that's the activity they're carrying out here. And it's difficult because we're the land of the free. This is a free democracy, and you should be able to do business and conduct media and so forth. But we need to be able to understand when it's not a citizen or somebody who's trying to do that in good faith, it's actually an agent of the CCP that's doing that. They need to be treated differently, and we need to figure out a way to properly identify them so that we can treat them for what they really are. And I think that's one of the main things that our government, at least, is wrestling with right now, is how to do that.
That was Levi Browde, Executive Director of the Falun Gong Information Center. And after a break, we hear more from him on the impacts here in America and what can be done. That's coming up in just a minute here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Next, we continue our coverage with Levi Browde, Executive Director of the Falun Gong Information Center. He sheds light on the Chinese regime's long arm of suppression, even here in America, and what can be done. Here's more. And so how does this tie into the Chinese regime's bigger goal? Because America is very clear in not calling China the enemy, but the Chinese regime sees us, or freedom-loving countries, as the enemy and vows to become the global hegemon and take us down. So how does this all tie into that?
I think Western governments need to look at Falun Gong as a case study. We're essentially the canary in the coal mine for what's about to be unleashed, or has already been unleashed quietly in many cases on the West. If you look at what they've done to Falun Gong inside China, and you look at what they're doing to Falun Gong outside China, you see the implements of their tyranny and how they use it. You see how they use, certainly inside China, from the brutal violence and detainment and arrests and organ harvesting, all that, but how they're going after Falun Gong outside China, that really is a demonstration of their capability and their will to violate every single international norm if it's going to be about retaining their own power. And if we think this is going to stop, or it has stopped, at Falun Gong or some of the other dissident groups, that's where we're really going to run into trouble. So I think we need to look at this as a case study. Looking at Falun Gong and what the CCP has done to them, this is an indicator of their capability and what they could do to the rest of us. And again, I think some of the informed China watchers are already telling us, well, they already kind of have, in terms of how they've gotten into influence our businesses and our government. This is already happening. So I think it needs to be a real wake-up call about our freedom, our democracy, our way of life. It's very much under threat, and Falun Gong is a good indicator of exactly how.
Through all of this research, what are some of the stories that maybe stood out, especially to you?
The most heartbreaking one, and I've been following this since 2007, is Shu Na. And this is a young woman. She was married to a young man who was in sort of this popular band in Beijing. In the months leading up to the 2008 Olympics, she's driving home from a concert with her husband that he had just performed. They are stopped at one of the Olympic checkpoints. Their bags are searched. They found a Falun Gong book. They're both thrown into prison. In 10 days, he's dead, certainly from torture. She then spends at least 3 years in a prison camp or a labor camp at that time, horrifically tortured. She's let out. She's actually detained again. Very difficult life. Her husband's gone. And then it rolls around the Olympics for 2022. And she is actually in Beijing at this point, and she and a number of her friends were going out into the streets of Beijing, and they're actually taking pictures and documenting what was happening, because what was happening on the ground regarding COVID was very different from what the CCP was reporting. So as citizen journalists, they were going out saying, hey, the world needs to know about this, because this is not true, what they're being told. So her and a whole group of friends were picked up at the exact same time. She's back in prison, and now she's been sentenced to, I think it's 6 or 8 years. So she's back in prison again. And her life story is really, it's heartbreaking, and it's also very telling of what's been happening over the last 15 years. And she's, you know, there's this woman in Belgium that she had befriended who knew her back in 2005, 2006, and she runs a website for her. And so every once in a while she gets pictures of Shu Na, and she posts them up there. But it's, I mean, her story is heartbreaking. I think the other story that comes to mind is a gentleman by the name of Feng Bin, which actually many people may know, but they don't know necessarily what his background. So Feng Bin is a Falun Gong practitioner. Like many practitioners, he's been in prison for years, was tortured horrifically. Like many Falun Gong practitioners, he acts sort of as a citizen journalist. And when COVID first hit in Wuhan, he became one of the leading and most visible voices reporting what was happening. When the CCP was saying, it's very minor, nothing's happening, he's the one whose footage was showing body bags, piles of body bags, what was happening in the crematoriums. And that was on CNN. I mean, it was all over the place, and became very famous for that. He was obviously quickly taken, captured. We believe he's still alive in a detention center in the area. We haven't got confirmation of that, but he was a Falun Gong practitioner. And I think that also shows you that this is, again, not just about Falun Gong. He was one of the, for many weeks, he was the leading voice in the Wuhan area, alerting the world about what was really happening. And so that's one of the other stories that came out. We have a couple other stories that are illustrative. There was this woman, a Chinese woman, who had traveled to Japan. I think she was visiting family, and while in Japan, Twitter's not blocked. She's on Twitter. She has an account. She was tweeting some things out. She comes back to China, and based on what she tweeted while in Japan, she's detained. She was beaten up horribly. And we see a lot of this sort of not just on Twitter, but what's unpopular in China and not blocked is WeChat. And so we have a lot of people who've been detained or monitored simply because of what they're exchanging on WeChat. So there's a lot of cyber activity that's translating into real world detainment, torture inside China.
And Levi, given that what happens to these Falun Gong practitioners seems to actually have a direct impact on, say, our lives here, right, with Feng Bin, for example, what can the concerned citizen do to try and help?
We need to get the word out first and foremost, and I think this is where Falun Gong is unique, because unfortunately there has been a tremendous silence on the Falun Gong issue. There are other tragedies unfolding in China, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, most recently Hong Kong, and you see those in the papers to varying degrees of truth, but at least you see them in the papers. With Falun Gong, it's been silent almost entirely for the last 15 years. It wasn't always that way, by the way. I mean, when the persecution first started from 1999 to 2001, I mean, the Falun Gong issue was on the front page of the New York Times 5 times in the fall and winter of 1999. Ian Johnson, who was working for the Wall Street Journal back in 2000, he won the Pulitzer Prize because he was the first one that kind of was brave enough to go into the heartland of China and actually record how, yes, indeed, Falun Gong were being pulled into prisons en masse, and yes, indeed, they're being tortured to death. And that was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. But very quickly, around 2002, 2003, the CCP was able to use some sort of leverage or influence where the media just went silent. Because if you look at the evidence, if you look at the human rights groups like Amnesty International, even our State Department's annual report on human rights, Falun Gong cases are there every single year, from 1999 all the way through up until this year. So the evidence is there, but the media went silent. And I think the media went silent, again, because the CCP understands that while they would rather not have other terrible stories about Tibet or Uyghurs on the papers, in Falun Gong, at least in their minds, they see an existential threat. This is the group that, first of all, was 100 million people strong, including military leaders, government leaders. This is the group that can expose them in a way that no other group can, and is, both inside China with those millions of people that are passing out flyers, and also outside China. And so they look at Falun Gong as an existential threat, and I think that's why you don't see it in the media. So coming back to your question, what can we do? We need to get the word out. That's the first thing. Even if it's as simple as sharing something on your Facebook page or tweeting something out, but we've got to get the word out because the media is really not covering this, and it's still happening. I think that's the most important thing. I think the second most important thing would be there are acts before Congress that can have some real teeth. Now, our Congress has been very supportive. In the last 20 years, they've passed 5 different pieces of legislation. Advocating for how Falun Gong is very peaceful and condemning the CCP for persecuting it. But this last year, there are actually 2 pieces of legislation that have some real teeth. One is an organ harvesting piece of legislation, and the other is the Falun Gong Protection Act. These can have a real effect, and I think Americans in particular, if they're concerned about this issue, they should call their representatives and make sure that they're behind these bills, because they can have real impact on stemming or curtailing or hopefully stopping the horrific practice of organ harvesting in China, and also raising the visibility of Falun Gong. And if we raise the visibility of Falun Gong, we are raising the voice that is going to alert us as to the danger we're under. And I think that could be extremely helpful for China. And let me just give you one other little example of that. Many years ago, when the SARS outbreak happened, 3 months before that hit the world stage, via this network of Falun Gong, we first heard of this mystery illness. We didn't know what it was, but all this information was coming about persecution cases, and along that same channel came stories of this mystery illness. The stories come out of China, and the Falun Gong community's ability to report on those is a vital piece of information. It's a vital channel for understanding what China's really about and what they're doing. And I think if we can raise the visibility of that, we're all going to benefit, because we're going to understand this threat and we're going to know how to respond to it and not be in the situation we are now, which we're behind the curve in terms of the threat and everything the CCP is doing to certainly the United States as well as other countries in the West.
And Levi, for those wanting to find more information or maybe read this report, where should they go?
So this report you can read for free actually on a website called FalunGongReport.org. Our website is faluninfo.net, FALUNINFO.net. So that's our main website for the Falun Gong Information Center. But this report is at falungong.org, and you can read through the whole thing. You can order a copy if you want to read the paper version, but the whole thing is available for free online.
Levi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That was Levi Browde, Executive Director of the Falun Gong Information Center. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you soon.